Have you ever seen a tattoo and felt your heart stop? Not because of how it looked, but because of the story it carried. This is not just about ink on skin. This is about silence, about sacrifice, about the kind of man most of us walk past without ever knowing who he really is. It was a Sunday morning. New Holland Central Restaurant was full. Every table packed, coffee cups clinking, children laughing. The smell of eggs and bacon filling the air. It was discount day for veterans, a day meant to honor them, a day to say thank you. But in one corner, far away from the noise, sat a man who no one cared to notice. His hair was snow white, thin like winter frost. His jacket was worn and frayed, the kind of coat that had seen decades of weather, and on his left arm, just peeking out from under the sleeve, a faded tattoo. A dagger, crossed through an anchor. To most it looked meaningless. Old. Worn out. Forgettable. A group of middle-aged men at the center table smirked, watching him. "I bet he drew that himself," one whispered. "That thing looks ancient. Probably fake." They chuckled, shaking their heads, going back to their plates of food. The old man, Robert Ellis, sat silently. No anger, no defense. Just him, his tray of food, and a glass of water he hadn't even touched. He had the look of someone carrying not just years, but entire lifetimes. And then, a waitress walked over, hesitant, her face polite, but her words sharp as a knife. "Sir, I'm sorry, but someone complained. They say you're making others uncomfortable. Would you please sit outside?" For a moment, the room went still. Uncomfortable silence filled the space. Every eye glanced toward him, waiting for him to argue, waiting for him to fight back. But Robert did not speak. He simply nodded, as though he was used to this, like it wasn't the first time. He lifted his tray, right hand trembling slightly as he gripped the plate, left hand holding his cane for balance. And he stood, slowly, carefully. Each movement, heavy as if even gravity had turned against him. Step by step, he walked toward the door. The prosthetic leg beneath him squeaked. It had carried him for decades, but now it bent and groaned with every step. A little boy tugged on his father's sleeve, pointing. "Dad, why does that man walk so strangely?" The father pulled the child closer and whispered harshly, "Don't look, he's just a homeless man." Homeless, that word cut deeper than the cane pressing into his palm. Because Robert Ellis was not homeless. He was not lost. He was not forgotten. By history. But in this restaurant, to these people, he was invisible. And then, like twisting a knife, the group of men at the nearby table spoke again. Loud enough for him to hear. "If he's really a Navy SEAL, then I must be a general." They burst into laughter, mocking, cruel. Robert's face didn't change. He didn't stop, didn't defend himself. But a single tear slid down his cheek and fell onto the cold, polished floor. No one stopped him. No one asked. Not a single person in that crowded restaurant cared. The manager saw it. He looked up from the counter, caught between guilt and indifference. For a second, he almost stepped forward. But then he turned away and served another customer. Robert reached the door, his shoulders hunched, his head low. But his dignity, though fragile, was still there. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, balancing tray, cane, and a lifetime of silence. All at once. Outside, the sun was bright, almost too bright. The light made him squint, blinking. Against it, as if the world itself wanted him out of sight. The outdoor tables were nearly empty. Despite the pleasant weather, no one chose to sit here. Maybe that's why they wanted him here, where no one could see him, where his presence wouldn't disturb anyone's comfort. Robert slowly lowered himself into a cold metal chair. The food on his tray was already cooling, eggs and toast. Simple, ordinary. But to him, it meant something deeper. This wasn't about saving a few dollars with a veteran's discount. This meal was about a promise, a memory of a fallen brother, a vow made long ago in a place far away. He looked through the glass window. Inside, families talked, laughed, clinked glasses. A world full of life and joy. Outside, so it was just him. Alone, isolated, separated by an invisible wall built of years, scars, and silence. And yet, he didn't complain. He didn't curse. His fate. Robert Ellis had carried this burden for decades, and he carried it now, with the same quiet strength. He took a slow breath, picked up his fork, and stared at his plate, his mind drifting not to the food in front of him, but to a battlefield half a century ago. Because that tattoo on his arm, it was not decoration. It was a story, a scar, a memory burned into his skin, and though no one here knew it yet, that story was about to speak louder than the laughter, louder than the whispers, louder than the silence, because someone was about to walk into that restaurant, a young man who would notice, a young man who would not look away, and in just seconds, the entire room would never be the same again. Outside that restaurant, Robert Ellis sat alone. The world thought they saw just an old man. But behind that, silence was a soldier's story. A story no one here could imagine. Robert Ellis had once been part of SEAL Team Bravo. It was 1969, Vietnam War raging. Missions carried out so deep into hostile territory that half of them still remain classified. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the kind to boast about medals. He was the man who worked in shadows, a logistics technician, the kind of role most people ignore. But his job was the heartbeat of every mission. He was the one who carried maps in his head, who planned the routes, who made sure men received ammo, food, and medicine, without which no soldier could survive. And then, in 1971, came the day that changed his life forever. Robert and his closest friend, James Harrington, were deep in Laos. Their team had been sent to create a supply route, something vital but deadly. The night before, James had pulled a folded photo from his pocket. It was a picture of a small restaurant back home. "This place," James had grinned, "when we make it back, I'm buying you the best burger of your life." They both laughed. Two young men making promises under the threat of war, but war doesn't care about promises. 8 miles from extraction, they hit the minefield. One wrong step, and fire ripped through the ground. The explosion threw Robert 30 feet into the air. When he came to, smoke filled the air. Pain burned through his body. His leg shattered, gone. And through the haze, he saw something that haunted him for the rest of his life. The medic zipping up a body bag, James Harrington's face and disappearing forever. Robert wanted to scream, wanted to crawl to him, but he couldn't move. All he could do was remember that promise, a burger, a meal they would never share. But even through the pain, Robert's mind stayed sharp. The radio wasn't working. The jungle around them alive with enemy fire. Men wounded, bleeding, desperate. It was Robert, half conscious, half broken, who remembered the coordinates. He guided the helicopter in, directing the pilot through. Heavy interference. 17 wounded men were pulled out that day, 17 lives saved. But James was not among them, and so, for the rest of his life, Robert carried that tattoo, a dagger through an anchor, not the official insignia, not something you could ever buy. It was the emblem of their small unit, a brotherhood. Now he believed he might be the last man, alive, who still wore it. When he came home, there were no parades, no medals pinned to his chest, no welcome banners. The mission was top secret, the sacrifice invisible. He opened a small auto repair shop in Colorado, lived quietly, fixed cars, for free for neighbors who couldn't afford it, taught young people how to work with their hands. He became Old Rob the mechanic, never talking about the war, never showing the world who he really was. But every year on Veterans Day, he went to a restaurant. Not for the discount, not for the food, but for James. To honor the promise, to sit quietly and eat a meal because his friend never could. And every year, he was misunderstood. Some thought he was a beggar. Some thought he was pretending to be a soldier. Some mocked. The tattoo. He never argued, never explained, because how do you explain something the world has already forgotten? So he lived in silence, every limp a reminder. every scar a story untold, and yet he carried himself with dignity, because Robert Ellis wasn't just a man with a cane. He was a man who had once guided broken soldiers out of hell, a man who had once saved lives when no one thought it was possible. But here's the part no one in that restaurant knew. Robert Ellis wasn't just another old man. He was Ellis G7, the name whispered in training camps. The man younger SEALs were told about as a legend who made the impossible possible. And in just moments, one young Navy SEAL was about to walk through that very door. And when his eyes locked on that tattoo, history would rise from the shadows. Back outside, Robert Ellis sat quietly. His fork touched the eggs on his plate, but he couldn't eat. Every bite felt heavy. Every laugh from inside the restaurant reminded him of the wall between him and the world. But then, the restaurant. Taidofor swung open. A gust of air rushed out, and with it walked in a young man, short hair, black civilian clothes, strong stride, every movement sharp, precise, like someone trained for discipline. This was Jackson Miles, 27 years old. A Navy SEAL home on leave. He walked in casually, scanning the room, when suddenly his eyes froze. There by the door, limping away with a tray in his hand, was Robert. Jackson's eyes widened, because he had seen that tattoo before, not on a stranger, but in training camp, in stories whispered by instructors. The dagger through the anchor, the mark of a small secret unit from decades ago. The unit that had written the protocols SEALs still use today, he whispered under his breath, stunned. SEAL Team Bravo. And then louder, "Sir, excuse me, were you with SEAL Team Bravo?" Robert stopped, startled. He turned slightly, looking up at the young soldier, his voice soft, fragile. "Long time ago, but yes, I was part of it." In that instant, Jackson Miles straightened his back. His heels clicked together, and right there, in the middle of a crowded restaurant, he snapped into a military salute. Silence. Complete silence. Forks froze in midair. Coffee cups hovered halfway to lips. Every eye turned toward the young soldier saluting the old man. Jackson's voice carried across the room. "Sir, you're the one they tell us about at training camp. You're Ellis G7, aren't you?" Robert's throat tightened. He couldn't speak. His eyes watered. All he could do was nod faintly. The group of men who had mocked him earlier turned pale. Embarrassment flushed across their faces. One pushed his chair back and slipped out quietly. Another stared at his plate, unable to look up. And then, something happened no one expected. An elderly woman slowly rose from her seat, her hands trembling as she began to clap, one clap, then another, and then an entire row of people stood up, applauding, clapping not just for Robert Ellis, but for everything he had carried in silence. Robert's lips trembled. His hand shook as he reached forward and gently squeezed Jackson's hand. "Thank you, son," he whispered. "That's enough. Just one person recognizing. That's enough." But Jackson wasn't done. He turned toward the crowd, his voice clear, firm. "This man before you coordinated the extraction of 17 wounded soldiers during Operation Swift Current. The tattoo on his arm wasn't bought in a shop. It was earned in blood. I stand here today because men like him created the standards we now follow." The room went still, so still you could hear hearts pounding. Strangers lowered their heads in shame. Waiters froze with trays in hand. And the manager, the same one who had asked Robert to leave, stepped forward nervously. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking, "there's been a misunderstanding. Your meal today is on the house, and please come back any time. We would be honored." Robert gave a faint smile, shook his head gently. "No need for special treatment. I just came to remember a friend." Jackson stepped closer. "Then, may I join you, sir? I'd be honored to hear about him." Robert nodded slowly, and together they walked back inside. Not to the outdoor tables, not to the corner seat, but to the best table in the house. From across the room, the men who had mocked him earlier sat frozen, ashamed, until one by one, they stood up and slipped quietly out of the restaurant, leaving their meals unfinished. The waitress who had first asked him to leave now approached with fresh coffee, her hands trembling. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "My grandfather was in Vietnam too. He never talked about it." Robert looked at her, eyes soft. "What was his name?" "James Harrington," she replied quietly. "I never met him. He died before I was born." Robert froze. His hands shook as he pulled a worn photo from his wallet. It was the same man, the same smile. The friend who had once promised him a burger. Robert's voice cracked. "Your grandfather? Promised to buy me a meal here someday." And in that moment, the silence was heavier than any applause, because the past and present had collided, because a promise made in war was finally being honored. The restaurant that day would never be the same. What began as whispers and laughter had turned into silence, respect, and tears. And word spread quickly. Someone snapped a photo of that young Navy SEAL saluting the old man by the door. By the next week, it was in the town newspaper. The salute that silenced an entire restaurant. The image traveled online. Shared thousands, then millions of times. People wanted to know, who was this man? Who was Robert Ellis? Neighbors were stunned to learn the truth. The old mechanic who fixed bikes for kids, who helped struggling families for free, was a war hero, a legend. A man who had carried a burden of silence for decades. School children began writing him letters. "Dear Mr. Ellis, thank you for being brave. Please come tell us stories about the heroes who never came home." For the first time in years, Robert felt seen, not as that old man with a cane, but as the soldier he once was, as the brother who had kept a promise no one else remembered. Jackson. Miles, the young Navy SEAL who had saluted him that day, kept in touch. Every month he wrote a letter by hand, not emails, not texts, but ink on paper, because he knew the value of words carried carefully, just like Robert had carried silence. And the following spring, the town did something no one expected. They organized a ceremony, not just for Robert, but for 12 other veterans who had lived quietly in the shadows, men and women who had given everything and never been thanked. Robert was the first to speak. He didn't boast, didn't talk about medals. He simply said, "I don't represent anyone. I'm just someone who tried to do the right thing," and lived quietly. In the crowd, Jackson stood, his hand over his heart, eyes filled with pride. From that day, Robert's small auto repair shop became something bigger, not just a place for cars, but a gathering place for veterans, a safe corner where men could share stories or sit in silence, knowing someone understood. The tattoo, once mocked, became a local symbol. The town even placed a plaque outside City Hall, a dagger through an anchor, with words carved beneath it, "Honor the quiet ones." Years passed. Jackson's career flourished. He became an instructor, training new SEALs, and in every class he told Robert's story. The story of the man who designed extraction routes, the man who saved lives behind the curtain of war, the man whose silence had spoken louder than any medal. On Robert's 85th birthday, there was a knock at his door. When he opened it, he found Jackson standing there, but he wasn't alone. 7 young SEALs stood behind him. Each one had traveled miles to meet the man they had heard about in training. They saluted him in unison. And Robert, for once in his life, let the tears fall freely. Most surprising of all, among them was Sarah Harrington, the waitress from that restaurant, the granddaughter of James, his fallen brother. She stepped forward, holding her family's hand. "He would have been proud," Robert whispered, his voice trembling. "Proud that his granddaughter met me. Proud that the promise we made in the jungle wasn't forgotten." The town honored him further. The street where his shop stood was renamed Silent Service Way, not just for him, but for every man and woman who served quietly without applause. And then 3 years later, Robert Ellis passed away. His funeral was unlike any the town had seen. Hundreds came, neighbors, strangers, veterans from across the country. His coffin was carried by Jackson, Miles and 5 other active SEALs, full military honors, the kind Robert had never received in life, were finally given to him in death. The old prosthetic leg, the one that had carried him through decades, was replaced in his coffin by a brand new one, a gift from a veterans organization inspired by his story, and on his tombstone beneath his names were words as simple as his life. His silence spoke volumes. His service changed lives, and maybe, just maybe, that's what true heroism looks like, not the loudest, not the proudest, but the ones who give everything and expect nothing. So the next time you see an old man in the corner with faded tattoos and quiet eyes, don't look away, because you may be sitting in the presence of a legend.